David is here actually on a return visit because he was here about a year ago and talked about Topsfield's contribution to the American Revolutionary War, which was really very, very enlightening. I really enjoyed it a great deal. Tonight he's talking about Topsfield's contribution to the Civil War, to our Civil War. And David is a professor of history at Gordon College in Wenham in the past 6 years. He has a master's in history from Tufts University and is currently a teaching fellow at Boston University and teaches also part-time at Salem State. I think he does other lecturing from time to time in different venues. He lives in Beverly and is a native of Everett. And so I'm happy to introduce you to David Goss once again.
Well, it is true that there is a display, or a small exhibit over at the Topsfield Public Library, and I'm hoping that after this talk perhaps you will be interested in going over to take a look at it. It does have, I think, a good deal of information pertaining specifically to the town of Topsfield. We also have a display case which has a selection of some reproduction artifacts that are very indicative of the sort of thing that Topsfield soldiers would have carried during their term of service during the Civil War. It's interesting, too, that this has come about directly as a result of the Kimball Grant. I don't know if those of you are aware of Jack Kimball and the gift, the scholarship that comes out on an annual basis, but none of it would have been possible for us were it not for the generosity of the Kimball family and the Kimball Foundation, and that is what actually was the stimulus for the exhibition, as for the Revolutionary War exhibition last year and the Civil War exhibition this year. And the material that we have here has come about as a result of researching this exhibition. So a little bit of background about that. Well, to begin, in the year 1860, the population of the town of Topsfield was 1,292 people. It's about 500 more than it was at the time of the American Revolution. Approximately 1/3 of this number were adult males. And of that group, of about 430 or so, 132 men left Topsfield to serve their country during the Civil War. Of this group of 132, 31 would lose their lives. As a result of their military service, or as a result of diseases contracted during their military service. In other words, slightly over 21% of all those who served from Topsfield died. Now, that's a rather sobering fact. It's a rather significant percentage of the town's population. It had a profound impact upon the community. And in fact, in many ways, it makes the Civil War the costliest war for Topsfield in terms of human life. And this is the story of that struggle and of the men and women of Topsfield who were forced to endure it. Now, before the outbreak of the Great Rebellion, as it is called on our memorial in the square, Topsfield had established a long-standing tradition of patriotism and community pride. Now, in part, this was based upon the town's impressive support of the patriotic cause during the American Revolution. It took great pride in the fact that they had made a major contribution. And every 4th of July, speeches, festivities were held on Topsfield Common to honor the 103 patriots of the Revolution who had served during that period of time. Beyond this, Topsfield had long been known as a community generally sympathetic with the abolitionist cause. During the 2 decades prior to 1861, the community had played host to numerous anti-slavery rallies, and by 1860, it had its own Topsfield Anti-Slavery Society. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, we have a banner, do we not?
Right there.
Yes, here it is, right over my head. So the abolitionist cause was, although very controversial in many parts of New England, and not liked in many parts, here it had a strong base of support. Politically, Topsfield was generally regarded as a conservative community, clinging to the Whig Party until its demise. The majority of Topsfield citizens made the transition from Whigs, along with Abraham Lincoln, by the way, to the newly established Republican Party. Indeed, the voters of this town overwhelmingly supported Lincoln in the election of 1860, and in fact, again, supported Lincoln in his bid for re-election in 1864. This was Topsfield on the eve of the Civil War. A politically conservative, conscientious, patriotic agricultural community, supportive of the newly elected president, Abraham Lincoln. Now, just a little historical footnote about what we know. While one would think that being supportive of Lincoln would be a fairly standard and conventional position for us to take, it's important to keep in mind that on a national level, it was not typical for most places, in fact, even for most voters in the United States of the 1860s, certainly around the election of 1860. Remember that the election of 1860, which put Lincoln into the White House, had how many presidential candidates? Four presidential candidates, which had a profound effect upon the way the election turned out. There was John Breckinridge, John Bell, Stephen A. Douglas, and of course Lincoln. Lincoln was elected with only 39.8% of the popular vote. He had 1,865,593 votes. Douglas was second with 29.5%, with 1,382,000 votes. And Breckinridge and Bell, two last candidates, they wind up with 848,000 and 592,000 respectively. What that simply means is that those who support Lincoln, like the town of Topsfield, in 1860, were on a national scale in a distinct minority. Over 60% of the American population in 1860 wanted someone other than Abe Lincoln to be president. But that was not Topsfield. It must be said that with the one slight exception of Rhode Island, Lincoln carried the New England states in that election. Well, with these community characteristics, it's not very surprising that within hours, and I mean literally within hours, of the shelling of Fort Sumter, immediately upon hearing of the outbreak of hostilities, 3 of Topsfield's farmer citizens left their work, walked the distance from Topsfield to Salem, and immediately enlisted in the Union Army. Literally within hours of having heard that Fort Sumter was being fired upon. These latter-day Minutemen of Topsfield were James W. Wilson, David Casey, and Edward Otis Gould. All 3 would survive the conflict and return to their homes and their plows in 1865. But these were only the very first volunteers. By May, just 1 month later, 1 month after Fort Sumter, at the Topsfield town meeting, it was voted to have an immediate recruitment drive at the Topsfield town meeting. They didn't even want to waste time going to another day. They wanted it right there at the town meeting. interesting sense of the patriotism of the community. This was in response to President Lincoln's April 15th presidential proclamation requesting that the free states should raise 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion. Well, by the end of that Topsfield town meeting, there were 113 Topsfield citizens who had volunteered to serve in the Army. For many of these, it would be the beginning of an experience that would end with death somewhere in the South. But all of them were motivated to follow in the footsteps of their Topsfield ancestors, 76. What was most convenient for many of this group was the fact that the location for basic training of the new recruits from Topsfield was fairly close by. While many Massachusetts volunteers trained at Fort Meigs, in Reedville, or on Boston Common, or any number of other places, most of Topsfield's recruits received their basic introduction to military life, where do you think? Right here at Topsfield. Recruit training camp was located at the southwest corner of Lockwood Lane and Washington Streets.
It's not far from where the barn was, this barn.
Really?
Have a barn.
Well, it was sizable. And it was, of course, given a name, and it was named Camp Stanton, named after Edwin M. Stanton, a Republican figure from Ohio who later becomes, in 1862 through 1868, U.S. Secretary of War. Here at Camp Stanton in Topsfield were pitched dozens of white canvas tent shelters, and here many Essex County volunteers were drilled in the standard basics of military life: marching, deploying into battle lines, handling the firing of rifled muskets, close-quarter drill, and responding to orders of authority automatically. And for Topsfield farmers and shoemakers, this was a dramatic break from their past lives. Following the completion of basic training at Camp Stanton, Topsfield recruits found themselves assigned to a wide variety of Massachusetts units, which would then be sent to serve in many, and I mean a great many, different locations during the course of the war. Topsfield boys saw service in some regiments raised exclusively from the local population, such as Farmer John Smith, that really was his name, of the Essex Zouaves, 23rd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, or his son, John Phillips Smith, who served with the 14th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. A little bit of a side note about this family, the Smiths, who gave actually 2 sons and a husband to serve in the Army, the Smith family of Topsfield. I came across a letter written by John Smith's wife after he had departed, Sarah Smith. This letter was written in October, 23rd of October, 1861, and I only quote it because I think it sheds some real insight into the effect, generally, of this war on most Topsfield families, or a good many Topsfield families, where the principal wage earner, the person upon whom the family was depending. Now, in this case, not only the husband, but the 2 oldest boys, all of them would be considered potential wage earners for the family. So she's doing without a significant source of income. She writes this letter to the selectmen of the town of Topsfield. I think it's rather interesting. I, Sarah Smith, wife of John Smith, Jr., on behalf of myself and my children. Then she goes on to list them. Charles Henry, aged 15. Charlotte Augusta, aged 13. William Alfred, aged 11. Eliza Ellen, aged 8. Adela Carey, age 6, George Hammond, aged 4, and little Harriet, age 1 year. They're a productive family. And remember, the 2 oldest, they're away. We are the family of John Smith of Topsfield, belonging to the Essex Zouaves of the 23rd Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers. For us, who have been dependent upon him for their subsistence, and who are now in necessitous circumstances. Is necessitous a word? Needy, necessitous circumstances, request that an allowance from the town be made for us under the Act of Legislation of 1861, Chapter 222, signed Sarah Smith. In other words, this town, as many towns, took the responsibility of helping to supply the needs of these families when their wage earners were away at war. And that was how many of these families were able to sustain themselves and survive. Any idea how much she did receive? What her monthly stipend would have been? $10. That's exactly right. $10 was what Sarah Smith received on a monthly basis to help her sustain that family over the course of each month. Remember, both her husband and eldest son, 2 actually, were taken from her household, representing a serious blow to her economy. And $10 a month was the amount. Now, about this particular Topsfield family, so large, with such a large investment in the Army, they have some good news and some bad news, and their story is not untypical. Good news and bad news. Well, the good news is that Sarah's husband, who incidentally was a native of Portsmouth, England, who had taken up residence here in Topsfield and bought a farm, he returns from the war, having served at the battles of Roanoke Island, New Bern, Everett Mills, Kingston, Whitehall, Goldsboro, all of these in the North Carolina war zone. And later he serves at Cold Harbor, which was a difficult service, and later also at Petersburg in Virginia. He reaches Topsfield on October 6th, 1864. So he comes home after a long, hard service, and he is safe and returns to his family. The bad news for the Smiths of Topsfield was that their eldest son, John Philip Smith of Company A, Massachusetts 1st Heavy Artillery, who had enlisted when he was in the first tour of duty, which later expired, then re-enlisted in the 14th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, was captured at the Siege of Petersburg. This was in 1864. June 22nd of 1864. He and some of his fellow Topsfield colleagues or comrades were sent from Petersburg to Andersonville. And he died on August 14th, 1864. His brother was one of the others that was captured and sent to Anderson. Now this raises the whole question, the issue of to what degree do these people make a sacrifice? What do other Topsfield families do throughout the war itself? I mentioned at the start of the talk that 31 Topsfield men had died during this war. Now, while some do die of battle wounds, others die of other causes. Malnutrition, in the case of John Philip Smith, or disease, fever. Well, those that die of malnutrition, total of them are 5. 5 Topsfield soldiers die of malnutrition. All of them die at Andersonville prison in Georgia, also known as Camp Sumter. These 5 are John Philip Smith, Daniel H. Smith, N. Harrison Roberts, Daniel Hoyt, Henry P. Neeland. Now, Daniel Smith and John Smith are both from the 14th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Daniel Hoyt, Harrison Roberts, and Henry P. Neeland captured in the same attack were members of the 19th Massachusetts Regiment, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was in the Irish Brigade. Is that not the case? Looking for Civil War buffs to be going, yes.
It was.
Yeah, I think the 19th Mass was one of the units in the Irish Brigade. All of these men died in the summer of 1864 and are buried, along with markers noting their names and units, in a mass grave in Andersonville, Georgia. For those of you that don't know, Andersonville, Camp Sumter, was built in early February 1864, and it existed for 14 months. Originally, Andersonville, where these 5 Topsfield boys died, was built to hold 13,000 prisoners. 13,000. Still pretty large. It actually received daily shipments of 400 soldier prisoners per day through the spring and on through June of 1864. At that point, it reached its maximum population of 32,000 prisoners by August of 1864. The Confederate government was unable to provide adequate housing, adequate clothing, adequate care, or adequate amounts of food for these soldiers. Over 13,000 of the total who were held there, the total number that were held there during the course of the war was 45,000 prisoners. Over 13,000 of that group died of sickness and or malnutrition. And these 5 are part of that number. One soldier wrote to his family after being released, "Would that I was an artist and had the material to paint this camp and all its horrors, or the tongue of some eloquent statesman, and had the privilege of expressing my mind to our honored rulers in Washington. I should glory to describe this hell on earth, where it takes 7 of its occupants to cast a shadow." Incidentally, the commander of Camp Sumter, Andersonville, Colonel Henry Wirtz, a Swiss immigrant, was the only Confederate soldier charged with what? War crimes. He was the only Confederate soldier in the entire war charged with war crimes at the end of the war. He was found guilty of wanton cruelty and hanged in November of 1865. Other Topsfield men who made the supreme sacrifice include Lewis K. Perkins and William Welch, Jr. Both of these men, who served in Union forces, along with the 54th Massachusetts, they were members of Union forces which, along with the 54th Mass, assaulted the Confederate battery Fort Wagner on Morris Island in Charleston Harbor between July 18th and September 7th, 1863. These 2 Topsfield men, Perkins and Welch, did not die from Confederate bullets, however. They succumbed to swamp fever as they spent weeks of summer camping in a humid and malaria-infested swamp. During this campaign, over 5,000 Union and 1,800 Confederate soldiers were engaged, which resulted in a total casualty count of 1,515 Union dead and 174 Confederate dead, among them Lewis Perkins and William Welch, Jr. of Topsfield. More Topsfield men who fall casualty to disease in southern climes were the following: cavalry trooper Eugene H. Todd, T-O-D-D, and Private John Warren Lake, both of whom died of fever in Port Hudson, Louisiana. They died during the famous Port Hudson siege between May 21st and July 9th, 1863, when Union General Nathaniel Banks sought to reduce the South's stronghold on the Mississippi. The siege, like the campaign against Fort Wagner, dragged on for weeks and exposed Northern soldiers not only to the shot and shell of battle, but the insidious effects of swamp fever, which took the lives of Privates Todd and Lake. Incidentally, the Port Hudson was the very last Confederate position on the east bank of the Mississippi to finally surrender, falling 5 days after the surrender of Vicksburg. Following this pattern of death by disease, more Topsfield soldiers on the Mississippi die from fever. Artilleryman John H. Bradstreet dies of malaria in New Orleans. And a man whose family built and owned this barn, and by the name of Private Emerson P. Gould, dies on June 6, 1863, in camp at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Gould was serving in the occupational forces under Ben Butler as an infantryman in the 48th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. So they're all over the place. They're in Virginia. They're off Carolina. They're in Charleston Harbor. They're on the Mississippi. They're in Louisiana. Now, these grim details bear out an important truth concerning the Civil War, which I think some people are not aware, and that is that disease took more people than bullets. 197,000 Union lives and 140,000 Confederate lives died or taken from disease, by disease. Battlefield deaths account for 112,000 Union and 94,000 Confederate lives. In short, during the Civil War, total deaths from disease for both sides equal 337,000 disease deaths. Compare that to battle-related deaths of 206,000. Put another way, 131,000 more men died from disease than bullets during the Civil War. And the high rate of death was from contracted illness, just as our Topsfield soldiers seem to bear witness to this fact. Incidentally, the total number of deaths during the Civil War was 633,000. Total number, 633,000 men. A figure slightly more than the total number of deaths for all other American wars combined. Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, Korea, Vietnam, World War I, and World War II. We're really good at killing each other. But it would be remiss to overlook the battlefield bravery of Topsfield's Civil War veterans as well. And there was a great deal of it. A number of Topsfield men died in some of the war's most vicious confrontations. For example, on December 15, 1862, Private Swinnerton Dunlop was among those who walked into a hail, a literal storm of lead at Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg during General Ambrose Burnside's ill-conceived attack, and he fell, along with 1,152 other Union soldiers, in an unsuccessful attempt to take that heavily defended hill behind a stone wall. And then, of course, there's a soldier who dies in the Battle of the Wilderness while serving under Ulysses S. Grant. Grant has a famous confrontation in the wilderness with General Robert E. Lee, May 5th through 6th and 7th, 1864. Let's see another battle. The Siege of Petersburg, probably the worst. The Siege of Petersburg in late 1864, we witness a group of Topsfield men. We've mentioned Private Daniel and John Philip Smith, 14th Mass, Daniel Hoyt, Harrison Roberts, Henry Neeland, all captured at Petersburg. But perhaps the most conspicuous of all of them was Lieutenant James Dunlop. Lieutenant James Dunlop died leading his company into the infamous Battle of the Crater. You familiar with that story? Pennsylvania miners were given orders to dig a tunnel, which was almost half a mile away, from the Union lines, under no man's land, and under the Confederate defensive position at Petersburg. this tunnel, then light a fuse and blow it up, hoping that they would somehow be able to blow a hole in the line of the Confederate defenses. This was known as the Battle of the Crater. When the gunpowder went off, what it did, in effect, was it created an enormous hole into which then charged the Union Army. It didn't go through the Confederate line, it just blew up a hole in front of the Confederate line. And the whole rest of the day, the Confederates spent their time shooting down into the hole, where Union soldiers were trapped, literally unable to move outside. That was the Battle of the Crater. It took place on July 30th, 1864. What makes James Dunlop's, Lieutenant James Dunlop's, contribution significant is the fact that his unit, under his leadership, had penetrated so far that at the time of his death, he was well inside the Confederate position, and that his body could not later be retrieved by his friends because it had already been buried by the Confederates inside their defensive position at Petersburg. For those of you that know the nature of that disastrous offense, you can appreciate Lieutenant Dunlop's effort to have advanced to within Confederate defenses when so few people were able to do so. But death was not always waiting on the battlefield, or even in the hospital. In 1865, two more of Topsfield's stalwart volunteers returned to their hometown here to die from illnesses contracted as a result of wartime service. These two soldiers were Privates Hayward Wiles and Otis F. Dodge. They came home to die. And although they died in their beds at home, their names are also listed along with those of their comrades on the Victorian marble plaque on the wall of Topsfield Town Hall, which records the names of, quote, the soldiers of Topsfield who gave their lives in the cause of their country during the War of the Rebellion. But what of the survivors? Topsfield produced two camps of the Grand Army of the Republic, which were made up of the veterans who came home alive. Their legacy is perhaps most evident at Pine Grove Cemetery, where cast iron GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, star markers, often with American flags, still identify these graves of these veterans who returned from the war and resumed their lives in Topsfield. And lest we think that these men forgot their comrades, I would share with you one interesting anecdote or story which illustrates the sense of community and support shared by those that came home on such a case. His name was Private Joseph Lovett. Joseph Lovett. He had served in Company F of the 40th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. He had enlisted in Topsfield on August 15, 1862, and was soon garrisoning the defenses around Washington, D.C. After a tour of duty on the islands of Charleston Harbor, he served on a campaign in Florida until May of 1864, when he and his unit were brought back, the 40th Mass came back to Virginia to serve in the Army of the Potomac. So he was in Charleston, he was in Florida, he was back up in Virginia. They moved these people around a lot. On May 16, 1864, he was shot in the leg at the Battle of Drury's Bluff in Virginia. Then he was taken prisoner by the Confederates. The Confederate surgeon amputated his leg, which was shattered, and it was probably the only way to save his life for fear of gangrene setting in. And that he was then paroled, one leg short. After a brief stay in the hospital, he was released on June 13, 1865, and he returned to Topsfield. Upon arriving home, he took it upon himself to help the widows of Topsfield's veterans to secure financial assistance and veterans' benefits. In a letter to the Board of Selectmen in Topsfield, that is still in the Topsfield Town Archives, we read that in 1866, he travels to the Boston State House to meet with officials on behalf of a Mrs. Deland, who lost both her husband and a son, and a Mrs. Thomas Perkins. He wrote, quote, "I am very happy to say that both of these ladies are now, Deland and Perkins, are now able to draw funds under our new state law. But I found moving up and down the State House steps a deal difficult with my crutch." Such was the caliber of Topsfield's Civil War veterans. Selfless, patriotic, without self-pity, generous. They I believe, more than met the expectations that had been set by their patriotic ancestors of '76. Incidentally, the last Civil War veteran of the town of Topsfield was a man by the name of William H. Wilds. He passed away in 1930. One final interesting note. This comes from an article written on May 23rd, 1984, Wednesday, May 23rd, 1984. And it's entitled, aptly, "After the War, We Are All Brothers in Death." In Topsfield, next Monday, a marker will be dedicated at the grave of a Confederate veteran, along with the many Union veterans who lie in Pine Grove Cemetery. It will be part of a traditional Memorial Day ceremony. As we stand there, that beautiful hillside, and watch the simple and unchanging rituals, the days of the blue and the gray may not mean much to the youngsters of Topsfield. They have never known the anguish of families separated by philosophical differences that sent one son to fight on one side of the country of the Civil War and another son to fight on the other. Nor have we adults. Only in a few old New England families have the stories been passed down through the generations of brothers, fathers, and sons who faced each other in battle in a war that split our country in two. Let us spare a thought next Monday and think about William Taylor, the Confederate soldier who lies in our northern cemetery in Topsfield, to which he moved after the war. Did people in Topsfield shrink from this southerner as they remembered the pain of a loved one in a blue uniform, killed on a Civil War battlefield by a boy in gray? Or did they put aside that ache and give him the work that he needed as a stone layer in the town of Topsfield? This man, William Taylor, died in 1911 and has been buried in an unmarked grave at Pine Grove Cemetery since that time. It is now fitting that his resting place should be marked. We can only hope he felt at home living here in Topsfield. After the battles, after the war, after the burials, after all, we are all brothers in death. And we must teach our children to be brothers in life as well. Thank you.
Not a question, but I'd like to add a kind of personal footnote. My name is Francis Roberts, and my wife and I live in New York. But my father and his two brothers, my father's name was Roland Roberts, and his brother Arlo and his brother Raymond Roberts. Some of the old Topsfield people may remember Raymond because he was the town treasurer for many years here. They grew up on Main Street, and where my grandfather and grandmother lived. And their grandfather, my great-grandfather, was one of the 5 people who died at Andersonville. He was living on a farm in Topsfield in 1864, and in May he entered the Union Army, and without very much training in those days, they just shipped him off. He then ended up in Baltimore and then on As I say, we live in New York, but when I saw this in the Boston Globe today that you're going to be talking, I wanted to come back to the old
Thank
town.
you so much for sharing. Appreciate it. You may be interested to know that also in the town archives, and it relates to this, his grave has been photographed.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, there's a collection of photographs. There's a Topsfield gentleman who went down to Georgia. Refresh my memory. What is he had a particular interest in this, and he went to the cemetery where, and these were trench graves. They were just mass graves.
Yeah.
But he went there and found where these Topsfield, these fellows were all in the same unit, Topsfield, and their names were on their headstones. They were all packed in, you know, literally next to each other. I think it might be in the exhibit.
I think it's in the
Yeah.
exhibit.
But his tombstone was photographed. So you may, now that you know, if you have a chance, take a look at it. Yes.
There's an enormous picture of Andersonville, sort of a woodcut, in the Ipswich Town Hall. As you go in, you'll see it. It's huge, almost wall size, several pieces. But that's interesting.
Yeah, it is, and I've seen that. And it is so detailed. The person who did it had been a prisoner, and he has this amazing memory. He draws every little hut, every little tent, every little shelter, hundreds of thousands of human figures in this tent, I mean in this compound. But it really does remind you very much of it was a concentration camp. But an interesting point was raised by a gentleman who was here about the deaths, southern versus northern, and that sadly the number of deaths. Would you like to reiterate what you said? I mean, we had a conversation because
Andersonville certainly was not a very nice place. There were 30,000 northern deaths in southern prison camps.
right.
Turns out there were also 30,000 southern deaths in northern prison camps.
Right.
So a place called Elmira, New York was not a very nice place to live either.
Elmira was one of the most notorious of the northern prisons. Yeah. And of course, I think the point that they brought up with Mr. Wirtz was the fact that apart from the just horrendous conditions and the overcrowded conditions of the camp, was the fact that most of these men did not receive any rations, or if they did get rations, they were insufficient. And the deaths, I believe, in Elmira were due to, in some cases, overexposure. They really weren't adjusting well to the northern climate. And most of them were still wearing what they had worn when they were captured.
Right.
And so there was a certain amount of overexposure at places like Elmira. So the death level was the same, but the ultimate cause was not quite the
Well,
same.
except on the southern side, by that period in the war, food was in short
Oh,
supply.
yeah, they couldn't even supply their own.
They couldn't supply their own army.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much.